Hello, my name's Angus, this is the Swapper, and this is my player character. Or maybe this is. Or maybe this. Or maybe all of them. Or maybe I'm the player character. These are the kinds of questions that the Swapper elicits. I inhabit the body of an astronaut stranded aboard the space station Theseus, and must solve puzzles using two abilities. I can create up to 4 clones of myself, and I can transfer my consciousness, and therefore control, into any one of them. However, solving these puzzles often requires sacrificing the clones, which raises 2 uncomfortable questions. Are they lifeless copies of the player character, or do they have an identity of their own? And am I justified in killing them for the sake of progress? This tension is what makes the Swapper an ethical game, defined by Miguel Sicart as, quote, a game in which the rules force the player to face ethical dilemmas, or in which the rules themselves raise ethical issues, unquote. I'll be using this concept as a point of departure to answer the question, how does the Swapper use its gameplay mechanics and narrative to encourage reflection on the value of life? This video will be divided into 2 parts. The first will discuss how the game characterizes the clones as disposable, and the second what the moral implications of their deaths are. For clarity's sake, when I refer to the player character, or PC, I mean the astronaut that I am currently controlling. If I swap to one of the clones, that clone then becomes the PC. The way in which the clones are characterized as disposable is through their visual, mechanical, and diegetic distinction from the PC. Within the fiction of the game, it is immediately made clear that the clones are just that, identical genetic copies of the PC. Because of this, it seems as though they are merely extensions of the PC's will, without any agency of their own. This is supported by the fact that all the clones copy the exact movements of the PC. When I jump, they jump. In addition, only the PC can use the cloning and swapping abilities, which is where much of the puzzle's complexity arises from. Furthermore, every clone has a visor, but only the PC's is lit up. Not only does this help with identifying which character I'm controlling, but it also gives the impression that this PC is sentient, and that by extension, the clones are not. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, when the PC is killed, say from falling from a great height, it's game over. I need to reload at the last checkpoint. But when a clone dies, nothing happens. In fact, a clone's death can be useful because it allows me to make another one, perhaps in a more convenient location. This simple fact is used to great extent throughout the game, specifically during traversal and puzzle solving. Progressing through the game requires making my way through Theseus in search of the next puzzle. In the beginning, this is no more difficult than holding down a direction button and occasionally jumping, but the more I discover of Theseus, the more difficult it becomes to traverse it. Eventually, I encounter long shafts where gravity is reversed, sending the PC flying upwards to her death. Unless, that is, she quickly makes a clone at a safe height and swaps to it, leaving her original body to smack violently to the ground. This is a good example of what Sicart calls closed mirroring ethics, which, quote, forces the player into an ethical position that can be uncomfortable, unquote, and in which, quote, the game world and occasionally the gameplay act as a mirror of the ethical experience the player has to go through in order to play the game, unquote. Because there is no alternative way of exploring the station, I quickly come to accept these sacrifices as natural and necessary, ignoring the question of the clones' identities. This is helped by the occasionally humorous ways in which they die. Perhaps the clearest example of closed mirroring ethics, however, is found in the ways in which I must solve puzzles. The objective of these puzzles is to collect security orbs, which are required for progression. Doing so requires careful use of the cloning and swapping abilities, as well as the deliberate sacrifice of the clones. Let's look at an example. In this puzzle, the orb is in the upper right corner. Normally, collecting it would be a simple matter of creating a clone next to it and swapping control to it, but the challenge here is that the red lights prevent me from swapping. I can swap into a clone on the upper platform, but the gap is too wide to jump across. So what do I do? The solution is to have a clone on the lower platform push the box onto the red light, obscuring it and allowing me to swap to a clone on the next platform. But when pushing a box, the clone moves much slower than usual, and the PC will quickly run out of platform. As such, I must create another clone behind the PC and swap to it. Moving to the right will cause the clone to fall to her death. And given how slowly the clone pushing the box moves, I am forced to do this over and over and over and over again until the final light is finally covered and I can collect the orb. As this puzzle shows, the frequency at which clones die in the process of playing the game, in combination with their distinction from the PC, means that I am encouraged to reconcile myself with these sacrifices by treating the clones as disposable, an attitude the implication of which I'll explain now. Throughout the game, I have been in contact with another trapped astronaut who looks suspiciously similar to the PC. It's only at the end of the game, after the sacrifice of perhaps hundreds of clones, that I learn that the PC is herself a clone of this mysterious astronaut. This recontextualizes everything that I have done up until this point. I know that the PC is sentient, the opening shot of her trying to escape the escape shuttle is proof of that, which means that all the clones I have been killing up until this point were also sentient, forced to do my bidding and plummeting to their deaths as a result. One could argue that the player is not morally responsible for these deaths. After all, I didn't know that the clones were sentient, not to mention that I was forced to sacrifice them to solve the puzzles. Christopher Bartow, however, refutes this line of reasoning. Quote, "While the player has little freedom to act, the player still has the free will to either identify herself with the actions that are committed within the game or not." Unquote. In other words, even if I am forced to do something in the game, I can still be morally accountable if I wanted it to happen. Quote, "When my actions correspond to my will, we can say that my actions are fully my responsibility, and that I can be held morally responsible for those actions." Unquote. And while I won't say that I always wanted the clones to die, their deaths also didn't mean much to me. As established earlier, the clones are characterized as disposable, worthless, mere resources to be used in the pursuit of progression. There are no immediate consequences for killing them, only rewards. It was sometimes even funny watching them die in mildly comedic ways. Because of this apathy, I found myself confronted both by my actions and by my attitudes towards them. Following this revelation and newfound knowledge, I am presented with the only explicit choice in the game. A ship has come to rescue the PC, but its captain has denied her entry due to her exposure to a disease aboard Theseus. A crew member stands on the opposite side of a chasm, within range of the swapper gun. I have two options. Either swap consciousness with the crew member, condemning them to death, or stay on this lifeless planet and die myself. This decision is the only example of Sicard's subtracting ethics, which, quote, "creates a moral experience but leaves the ethical reasoning to the players, thus respecting their presence as moral agents," unquote. Essentially, the game is asking me to reflect on my actions so far. Given how many people I've killed up until this point, does one more sacrifice matter? Is my life worth more than that of this crew member? Or does sparing his life render all the previous deaths worthless? By putting my ethics to the test in this way, the game is also asking me to reflect on my identity as player. Throughout this video, I have interchangeably referred to the PC as her own person and as a mere extension of my will, just like how the clones are extensions of hers. In a way, she is my clone within the game, something I control and use for my own ends. When I send her falling to her death, my only reaction is a brief spurt of annoyance at having to start the puzzle over again. I do not feel remorse at having killed her because she is just a video game character, a tool for me to use. But haven't I learned where that kind of thinking leads? The clones were also just tools, and yet I felt guilty for having killed them once I learned what that actually meant. This sensation of guilt is what leads to the game's ethical conclusion, that the arbitrary nature in which I choose who to control and who to sacrifice highlights the arbitrary ways in which I might support or discriminate against different people in the real world. The fact that I identify with one group of people, in the same way in which I inhabit the body of one specific astronaut, does not invalidate the experiences or beliefs of the countless other groups in the world, nor the identities and sentience of the clones I do not inhabit. This is the ethical standpoint that the closed ethical design instills in the player, that everybody is equally worthy of life, regardless of what you know or do not know about them. The final choice goes beyond the boundaries of the game and asks me, do I value my own life above those of others? And after playing this game, the answer is an emphatic no. To sum up, the Swapper uses two techniques to encourage the player to reflect on the value of life. It uses its gameplay mechanics to force the player to sacrifice countless clones, and then uses its narrative to make them account for the implications of their actions. By confronting the player with the fact that they value the identity of some characters to the exclusion of others in a video game, it asks them to similarly consider the ways in which they value the identities of real people in the real world. The fact that the clones seem disposable to us doesn't mean that they're soulless, and the fact that we can't swap into the bodies of the people around us doesn't stop us from recognizing and understanding their unique identities.